go. Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us here in Grow Hub. Yay! For a lovely chat with Sandra. We're here to talk about the soil and the microbiome in soil and the relationships that it has with our plants. So yeah, I'm not going to take up too much space. I've got lots of questions for Sandra down the track, but I'll let her do a little intro. But look, thank you so much, Sandra, for coming. She's been connected to Subpod for a while now, ever since we met up in Woodford. I'm not quite remember how that happened, that connection, but it's so great to have you here because I know your passion and enthusiasm for all things soil and plants and microbes is yeah, just as ours, if not more. So great to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on board. It's lovely to meet everyone wherever you are. And yeah, I suppose I can just start introducing myself. Like if you think two shins in the car, that's my last name. Two shins of your legs inside a car. That's all you have to think about. And you'll know how to say my name, Two Shins Car. That's always a point of, people ask. So I thought I'd say. But yeah, definitely soil microbes is a thing for me, and especially fungi. And fungi are becoming more sort of, mainstream now, but they're very hidden and hardly anyone studies them. So I decided to study them because they have amazing gifts that they have offer to the environment. And without fungi, there's no plants. So therefore we can't breathe. We're very much reliant on these guys. So there'll be a lot of chat about fungi, and I hope you guys love fungi. But yeah, my background is in sort of like looking at the cellular mechanisms of fungi, and how they protect trees from heavy metals, and then also the agricultural side of stuff, how fungi on the roots feed plants and how we can harness their power and help them to be there and actually do their job. So at the moment, they're not getting much of a chance in agricultural systems, but we can definitely change that through chats such as these.
Oh, thanks, Dan. He's just saying he's a fun guy too.
Yes.
Awesome. And look, of
Coincidental.
course, we've got Peter Howard here, our Dr. Compost, who of course has a lot of knowledge and experience in working with soils and microbiology and compost and worm casting. So great to have you here, Peter. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'll definitely have some questions for Sandra later in the talk, because it'd be nice to drill down to some of the more wonderful intricacies of the subject. But we'll do the basic stuff first.
Yeah,
So I'll hold
yeah.
off.
Look. I'm going to start off the conversation because I'm the basic. I'm the one that doesn't have all of that depth of knowledge, and it wasn't until I started gardening and realizing that when I wanted to grow things, that it actually wasn't about the plant; it was all about the soil. And so, look, I'd love you just to do a really, if you can, I don't know if you can break it down for those of us who you need to understand the relationship between soil, plants, the microbiome, the life in the soil, because of course, as Subpod, we're always talking about, feed the soil, feed the world, which is feed the plants. So, yeah,
Yes.
I'd love you just to give us a really quick rundown of how soil and plant relationships work.
Yeah, so it's really cool because when you think about soil, really, the way the conventional definition of soil is, sand, silt, and clay. It's just the physical part, the rock part, that soil comes from. But really, it's supposed to be those components that are being utilized by the life forms. They're basically using and extracting nutrients from the sand, silt, and clay. So it's the little life forms, the little bacteria and the fungi and all the other creatures that consume them. The whole soil food web is what actually makes soil, because plants can't access those nutrients otherwise. So it's not soil if we can't grow plants, right? So it's all about making sure that those organisms are present, and then they create the spaces between those particles, so moisture can be retained, so oxygen can enter. They create glues, and they also degrade the rock. So fungi and bacteria have all these enzymes where they can literally decompose rock, decompose the sand, silt, and clay. And so when they decompose it, they're extracting nutrients for themselves, but also as a result, they feed the plant, because they have to, like us, poo out or poop out, depending on where you're at in the world. They will have to excrete those nutrients that are in excess, and they digest them, and then they then release them, and that is the fertilizer for the plant. The plant needs the microbial excrement, basically.
Oh,
And anything that eats the microbe, like a bigger organism, like a nematode or a protozoan, and I can describe those to you later because I think it'd be great to meet the microbe team. They basically eat the bacteria and the fungi that are the most nutrient-rich organisms on Earth. And because there's too much nutrients in the bacteria and the fungi, whatever the animal eats has to then poop out, and that's your fertilizer. So
wow.
basically,
Okay.
they're feeding directly by just being around the roots, and in exchange, the plant gives what we call exudates, which are basically just sugars from photosynthesis and amino acids and other things that come from the plant, but mainly it's sugar, carbohydrates, carbon, liquid carbon, going down from photosynthesis, feeding those organisms directly. So they're very much in the root zone, and it changes depending on the microbes. The pH changes. Soil pH is just a thing we do, but actually it's the root itself has got different pHs depending on what organisms live there and what chemical and signaling and interactions are happening. So it's very intricate and very tiny system. But the major players of all that as well is what often is forgotten, especially because we're fertilizing. The fungi that actually symbiotically live on those roots, they literally mine the soil. And when I say that, that's in the most softest way of explaining the word, but they have those enzymes where they can grab those nutrients, especially phosphorus, nitrogen, and and other minerals and micronutrients from the rock and from the organisms that are excreting all that. And because they're symbiotically covering the roots, so to speak, and like going inside of the roots, like at the cell interface, they're basically feeding those nutrients directly coming from the other microbes and from themselves. And then as the plant, the plant, then they're like, well, now you need to give us some sugar so we can feed all these other glorious creatures that are feeding you, my plant. So it's a very symbiotic and very cooperative. Like each plant has its own microbiome that it chooses depending on what food the plant wants to provide. That's what's going to be attracting, these particular microbes that need that nutrient will come. And so the plant is very choosy as to who it interacts with. And as a result, not only does it get fed the yummy food that it specifically wants, because those bacteria and those fungi will give it that food that it requires, because they all have different requirements, just like us. We might like, chocolate over vanilla better. Do you know what I mean? It's the same sort of the flavoring, so to speak. So, and then once that goes into the plant, there's an exchange. At a cell level, there's constant exchange of sugars and other exudates coming from the plant, from photosynthesis, and then the animals, the microbiome, the microbes feed that plant the specific food it requires, and therefore taking up spaces, and therefore not allowing pathogens to eat that plant. So when you've got a nice, lovely community working together for the plant, there is no need for disease to even exist. Everything's in balance, the right oxygen, the right moisture, all the minerals, so the plant is healthy. It's not signaling, going decompose me, because there's literally signaling between everything that eats the plant. When the plant is sick, it will say, eat me, and so pathogens come up, but that's because its shield is broken. Its immunity is no longer there. So the microbes and the plant are an essential together. Like we can't just think of a plant or just the microbe or just the fungi. It's like without all of them being present, an entire system, an entire little ecosystem that the plant is, it needs to be together. So our role is to harness that and allow that to happen, because that's how forests are fertilized. That's how forests grow. They never get fertilized by humans. Everything works through the poop loop, we call it. And that's the poos being excreted, and that's the food for the plants, and the plants eat themselves. When you think about it, the craziest thought about this whole thing is, as the plant drops its debris, its dead, organic matter, its leaves, it then gets all decomposed as well, because that's the other component of the soil is we need the organic matter. So we've got the minerals, we've got the microbes, now we need the organic matter. And that's also being decomposed in the same way by all those creatures. And as that happens, the plant then receives those same nutrients it let go of. It's constantly cycling and growing because more sun is freely available to it. And the microbes keep demanding that sugar, especially the fungi. So you've got this beautiful system of self-perpetuating, never-ending cycle of growth, decay, and feeding of, and everyone's fed and happy and working together and
Well,
collaborating.
that's it, yeah, and that's in a healthy system like in nature.
Yes.
That's what we really want to start learning, is how do we mimic that in our own little not only like raised garden beds, but say like my potted plants that are sitting
That's
here,
right.
you know,
That's
how
right.
can we look after the soil, therefore the plants, and encourage that intricate relationships that are so necessary
Yes,
for soil and plant health, and of course, if we're interested in growing food, of course, healthy food, and then for us to eat and become
absolutely.
healthy humans. So
Yeah,
yeah, I'd love to hear a bit more about how can we help to support that
yes.
in our gardens.
Well, yes, and this is exactly what the subpod is about, really, isn't it? Having those worms, having something that we keep adding to, but also just like the tree recycles itself through that system, we can do the same. So everything that is in the garden besides the seed or the fruit that you harvest should stay there, because that's your perpetual organic matter staying there. But also the fact that, in nature, in soil, worms do compost organic matter, and so do other creatures, and worms also go through the soil. So that's another, like, a bigger animal, the bigger biological part also, that plays a huge essential part in it. And I think while we can do compost, thermal compost and other ways, and static compost, and in nature, kind of, that's how it almost happens, that everything is not heated but chopped and dropped. And so therefore you've got this organic matter perpetuating the cycle, and the animals are always happy. The livestock that we're farming in the soil, they're happy because they're getting food, but the plant also has to always be present. And especially with these fungi that, a lot of the plants we grow are annual. And so when we harvest, we remove the root also, but without that root and without some live plant being there, there's a sort of a time where this fungal livestock, the symbiotic fungi, may die out. And we don't really want that, do we? We want to perpetuate them living, because they're really dependent on the plant. They're obligates. They don't just, they've got an obligate relationship, whereas like where without the sugar, they eventually die, and the spores will only last a certain amount of time. So very much having that ecosystem always planted, always covered, and always fed organic matter. And that organic matter could be coming directly from the plants that you're growing, but also having, because our soils are so depleted of life, and if you're just starting even a subpod garden, and there's only a limited amount of those microbes present. So the best way to do it is to cultivate them. And whether it's through a system of subpod, there's another system that I'm sort of currently working on, where you got a good fungal biomass developing in a wheelie bin on the bottom of it, and then you harvest the fungi, because the fungi essentially is what's missing the most. And they're the ones that really provide the carbon sequestration, and also so much of that hot, because they're so long as they grow in these chain-like cells, right? So they really hold particles together, and the bacteria glue those particles, and that really allows your moisture to stay in there. So without that, when you're constantly tilling and turning, you're getting rid of those thread-like structures that fungi produce. And this is what we call the mycelium, or the mycelium, if you want to remember the word if you haven't heard it before. I think everyone has by now, but this mycelial network really gets sort of chopped up in agricultural systems. And I think when we're gardening, we don't think about it much either. So really the layering, the way of no-dig gardening is where you keep like nature, just mimic your nature. But because the worms are missing so much, we've got the worms to help us, the composting worms. So maybe just thinking of it like, what does a forest do? The creatures are already there. The plant is feeding them continuously. The plant chops and drops itself all the time. And the fungi decompose. The decomposer fungi decompose those woody bits. So if you're dropping your plant matter on there, always having some mulch, some hardier mulch. And even in your subpod or in another worm farm system, you want to add fungal foods. And so, the food that we eat normally is nitrogen rich, so it feeds bacteria. It's a very simple kind of food, like a mango, maybe not the pip itself, but the skin or the banana peel or whatever. But the fungi don't really get much out of that. They like the hardier stuff. They like they sort of like, they want to be carbon rich and protect themselves. And to get that carbon, they need woody material. So always having that mulch layer, or even in your worm farm, thinking about how you can utilize more hardier perennial weeds and putting them through a mulcher and putting them on the garden, or something that's not simple to decompose. And you can see that, a banana peel will go really quickly, or an apple will just, rot away really quickly, but say sugarcane mulch will stay longer. So that's how you can engage it, like go, okay, that's definitely carbon rich. It's brown, it's hardier to
Yeah.
decompose. That's my fungal food.
So a
Yeah,
certain amount of your garden waste you could chop up, or some of your flower
totally.
stems or something that you know might
Yeah,
throw somewhere else to decompose. You could start using that. And leaf litter, probably leaf litter.
absolutely.
Like I know Peter Howard loves the leaf litter, especially if
Totally.
it's been rotted down for a while, because it gets all these microbes and
Wonderful.
bacteria.
So, just to give you a little example of the leaf litter, I had gutters that were filled with eucalypt leaves, and I didn't pay much attention to it for 10 years until I saw plants sticking out of the gutter, and I was like, maybe it's time to clean my gutter. So I went up there, and then I looked at it, and it smelled really good and looked really good. I was so like shocked. So I looked at it under the microscope. Whoa. These beautiful organisms that were so hard, that seem so hard to get back into soils were in this leaf mulch, because there's constant cycling of water and decaying over time, and 10 years worth of a decay, and and that becomes like a sponge. So I realized, like Peter has, that actually leaf litter has got all the microorganisms, and they're coming from nature. So if you can just think of it, not just sugarcane mulch and stuff you can buy, that most likely came from a farm system that it's not very biodiverse, and it's all about biodiversity and biodiversity of food we add as well. When I say bio, well, it is bio, it's biological matter added to the system, but it's more of a like your feedstock for your livestock. The more varied that is, just like our diet, you can't just live on bananas, but if you live on like more fruit, your life becomes a bit more interesting and tastier. It's the same thing. So the whole system is based on, as you say, like getting other plants from your garden and putting that in, because there's always microbes. Like there's nematodes, which are the feeders of bacteria and fungi. They are actually the most ubiquitous animal on earth, and biomass wise, I think they're like the biggest biomass of all animals on earth is nematodes, but we don't see them, and they're just tiny worms. They're just like the worms we actually use, but they're tinier and they're microscopic. So it's just wonderful, because all these little creatures sort of like, I love Elaine Ingham's work, because she's the first one 40 years ago was sort of pioneering this, when she asked, what are all these animals doing around what I'm studying? She was studying fungi, and no one could tell her, and they said to her that they don't do anything, and she's like, no, they wouldn't be there if they didn't do anything. So she started studying these relationships, and there's only a few key players that you need to keep as your livestock, and everything else falls into place. When the plant's got the right creatures supporting it, and we're feeding those nutrients, as you say, through our waste and through our own whatever we're already creating and the nature around it, it will just become a really rich, beautiful, biodiverse system. And the worm farm is so good at the fact that you can cultivate it over time. You can go to a forest and pick up a tiny bit of mulch or whatever, not like strip it and take everything from everywhere, I'm not suggesting, but any little bit of time, because they're microbes. You can take a leaf like Peter does, and that leaf will already have all these amazing microbes you didn't already have in your worm farm.
Yeah,
And
so if you're in a city, you could just go to a park or something and
that's
just grab a
right.
few leaves and throw
That's
them into
your
your
gutter.
subpod, or into the garden on top of the soil. And
Yes,
I
yes.
love that. I love the
Isn't
idea
it
of like we're
wonderful?
here just to support the system doing what it does naturally. We're not actually adding anything apart from what nature's already provided us. And of course, that's the beauty of the worm castings, is that
That's right.
they have a really close relationship with microbes, don't they? I like
Yes.
there's a whole lot there that goes on. Like it's not just a worm farm where it's just the worms. I mean, can you talk a little bit about
Yeah,
what
look,
happens inside a worm farm, or
I honestly want a
vermicompost?
miniature myself. Miniature. I would love to live in the worm farm. That's how much I love it.
Peter
Every
has.
time I look in there, I'm like, oh, I just love this stuff. Like all the creatures moving in and out, and that's just what I can see with my naked eye. But when you put it under the microscope, like it's incredible to see what's in there. And that relationship is so amazing that people have even studied like specific like worm species and the preference, because like everything has its food preference, and the worms will eat specific fungi families or specific fungi species more than others, certain worms. So, and they choose and pick. So they don't actually eat food. Like what we feed to our worms is not what the worms want. The worms wait till the fungi and the bacteria start breaking it down, and they literally micro feeders. They only seem to be eating the food because those other creatures, the little tiny microscopic stuff, is decomposing it enough. And so they proliferate so much that the food is almost broken down, and then the worms go, right, now there's enough for me. I don't need to work hard to digest. I'm using these microbes as my food source, because they actually have all the nutrients. They extracted the nutrients from the food, and they've mushed it enough and decomposed it enough with their enzymes, and then the worm goes, right, excellent, I've got what I need now.
Okay. So
So
that's why it can take a time for a subpod system to get
that's
built
right.
up to speed, is it's not just the worm population, but also the microbes population where they're just starting to
Well,
break the
I'll,
food
I'll
chain.
add I'll add one detail to that, which is fascinating. The worms actually breed bacteria inside of their
That's right.
intestinal tract, and so you'll actually colonize your system with bacteria as soon as you're adding the worms.
And fungi, yeah.
Yeah, and
And these
fungi as well.
spores, like the fungal spores, while there might be some good decomposition of it's funny, like I've literally even got a photo of a nematode pooping out. So let's say the microscopic worm is the nematode. I've got a photo of it pooing bacteria out.
Mhm.
So, and I caught it on video. Like I was so excited. I was yelling and screaming with joy when I saw my nematode doing a poo, because I was like, oh, this is what I always talk about, this poop loop stuff. And look, it's right in front of me. It's happening. It's like pooing right in front of me. Thank you. But that's the reality of it, that you're so right. Like I look at worms as the soil, like an intestine that walks around and
Mm.
an inoculator. They literally inoculate as they go from place to place, as they poop out whatever they eat. Some of the stuff doesn't get decomposed fully, so the spores of fungi, some bacteria will be passed through their intestines. Some of them will be digested, some of them get away, and so they get enough, obviously, nutrients from those, but whatever is in excess, they poop out and they inoculate. They keep going and inoculating, and that's the lovely
Love
job
that.
that they're doing. And they're so cute. I mean, worms are so beautiful. And then when you look down at the microscope, you realize, wow, it just keeps going down, and they're just as pretty, all those creatures under the microscope. They're fascinating and fun.
Now, look, Dan's just raised his hand. Dan, did you have a question on this or something to contribute?
Yeah, I did. So with the subpod system, would you recommend adding mycelium to it?
Mycelium, like the fungal.
Mycelium?
Yeah.
Yes. Like a
Look, I don't think you have to add it, because it will already exist naturally on hardier materials. So like putting mulch down even, and as it breaks down that mulch over time, and especially mulch that if you can afford somehow, depending on the size of your system, but if you can even add woody mulch, that's going to be inoculum, because that wood is already filled with fungi. The fungi already live in trees before the tree even goes down to the ground. Like literally, if you go up in a canopy, you will see fungi growing in the canopy. So what I'm saying is, every time the fungi are already there, and all you have to do is just feed it, and that's, so even when we add any kind of mulch to your worm farm or your garden, that's already inoculated. You don't have to look for it. Do you know what I mean? It's there. It's just that whatever the more diversity you add, the more fungal, different types of fungi will be there, and that just increases the health of your system. So it's always, the more varied you can make it, the more innovative you can be, the more you can shred, like card, anything. Honestly, like I think that's the key I'm discovering. Everything is about, the more biodiverse, the more healthy, the more resilient, the more giving, the more it's like rainforest is like the pinnacle of biodiversity. We want to go, there's always this drive in nature to go towards diversity. So if we can already start by having diverse food source, then it will create microbial diversity, and then that will create plant diversity, and it just keeps going and going and going.
I'll just offer one little idea that, so because in the subpod you're constantly aerating and you're disturbing the medium, it's probably good to add the carbon in both places. Make sure you're adding it to the soil around the subpod, so the filamentous processes of the fungi can be established and keep that architecture constant. And inside the subpod, where it's being disturbed all the time, you can let fungi grow, but you're going to be disturbing. That's just inevitable about the nature of that delivery system. So probably both would be a good idea.
Yeah, the thing is with a subpod and other sort of worm farming, like it's a great thing in terms of, like, if you have just a worm farm, say you're not even a gardener, that's how I started. I just never wanted to put my food in landfill, and so I've always experimented with whatever was available, like a worm farm. You just buy one of those stacked things, there's so many designs. But what I'm learning now is that fungal biomass takes a year or so to develop, so and that's sort of like the system I'm using now is where you harvest from the bottom, and I'm calling them worm flow bins, because you basically have a wheelie bin, and I never knew that you can go quite deep. But the only reason why it's so deep, even though the worms are in the 20 top centimeters, is because on the bottom, as those castings mature, that's where the fungi have the chance to develop, because they're much slower growing, much slower eating. They're eating way hardier materials, so it takes time. But then so if you wanted to improve your like sort of situation even further, besides having the subpod in there, you could go to that system, and you can also develop, I mean, depending on how much passion you have for this, you
Like
can go an extra mile. Like I have different worm like farms, or bathtub and this, but I
different
know that
things,
this
yeah.
system is the fungal dominated one, and for me it's all about, if I'm going to work with farmers and gardeners and I want carbon sequestration and I want all these things, I know that I have to think about the fungi, I like sort of like, I'm like, well, wow, okay, they are the missing component. We need to return it. So let's set up systems where we can harness them further. And I've got, a few projects going on with like another composter that's just like, it's got no worms, but worms could go in there as well. And it's a Johnson Sue bioreactor. And that's just made at Woodford. We made it for the mycology research project, where we've just like gotten all the clippings of all the organic matter from around the forest. We put it through a mulcher and we created a giant donut shaped compost, and it takes years for it to develop to that fungal biomass, but the fungi are already there because they came from the dead debris. And in fact, last night I hatched a fungal egg that came from that mulch, because there was mulch I bought to create as well, not just our own stuff, but we bought some additional one. And those stinkhorn fungi, you might even have some growing in your subpod sometimes, so I tried to take a time lapse of them growing at night. It was so exciting. It didn't turn out really well, but that was my first go. And 2 more grew right in front of the camera out of focus. So 3 of them hatched last night, and because they're like an egg. So this is what I'm saying, like, as you start bringing your biodiverse food sources, and especially from your garden and your nature, and just become very much like, oh, what else can I add to get those plants even more happy, even more biodiverse microbiome added to them, then that's where you start discovering these fun things as well, and I
So
know
that,
little systems are harder to observe things, but maybe not, actually maybe easier, because you've got
Well,
a simple
there
patch
is
to look at.
there is an example that I can mention, which is when you set up a hugelkultur bed. So that
Yes.
involves putting a lot of woody, even up to the point of tree trunks at the bottom of your garden bed, and overlaying that with soil. It takes about a year, but you'll notice fantastic benefits, just as you're describing, where there's time for that woody waste to break down, the mycelial processes form, and you get a garden bed that will outcompete, especially for perennials. I'm growing a lot of my
Yes.
Mediterranean herbs in hugelkultur beds now for that reason, and they
Beautiful.
really, really do well. So it's another strategy you could think about, of favoring a
Yes.
constant fungal source that's undisturbed.
yeah, so
Yes.
that's like, your hardy herbs that you don't pull out. But I love that we talked about the other day about not pulling
Hmm.
your dead plants out, like your lettuces or whatever, that when they're finished, and actually just cutting them off, maybe at the, I don't know, cutting them off at the soil level, and throwing the leaves into the subpod, but then allowing the roots to still be in the soil.
Yes.
To me was like, wow,
Yeah.
that was a really an aha moment, about, because then you think about it, all those air channels, as well as
Yes.
all that bacteria and microbes and fungi that go into building the soil. You're just ripping all of that out and getting rid of it
Yes.
when it's already been happening there.
It's your
That's
inoculant, it's your
yeah.
inoculant for your next plant. And even though the plant families might differ, because obviously you're putting like, different plants, there will be still some similarities, and some fungi, even the symbiotic ones, might get transferred to that new plant, even though, sometimes they just like, maybe not, like they might
Mm.
require a different microbe, but it doesn't matter, because once again, you've got biodiversity, you're going to be planting lots of things. So ensuring that root system stays there. And in doing so, not only are you, like, as you say, replacing something that, like a structure that's already there for everything to be and is present, but also over time, that dead root system will break down. So that's your food
Food.
for those microbes as well, because it's
Yeah.
not photosynthesizing anymore. And an inoculant for your next plant. And also the structure is so important. I think this is where we like have gone so wrong with agriculture, where we started tilling, when it was horse and cart or whatever, donkey, whatever, bull, it was so still minimal. And now the compaction starts developing. We had a chat about that, didn't we, as well, how you know,
Yeah.
rain
Yeah.
compaction happens, and every time you till or you move or you rip out, you're actually creating this sort of disturbance. And when you create disturbance, you put everything back to its successional stages, where the bacterial and fungal biomass changes so much and the fungi decrease so much that you're actually going back to like weedy growth. And while tomatoes and other things we eat are really weedy, so they don't require much really of this microbiome to be fungal dominated like trees do. However, I think it's just a beautiful system that if you do have that dominance, you're setting yourself up and teaching your children and teaching the community that that is an important part of giving back to nature, because we've taken so much through those agricultural and other processes, you know. So I think even if you're like, you don't have to go crazy with it, and I know the subpod would do perfectly with this if the microbiome is well done, and even if the fungi don't develop in that system, the plants you're growing in the small things, they're completely supported, you know. I'm not like it's great, like I have absolutely everything towards like good feelings about that. It's just that I suppose you know, having these things we're discussing now, these concepts of like how does water even impact when and the disturbance that happens and the compaction and stuff, we can avoid all that by having that fungal biomass, you know. So it's, even though it's not like so essential for our tomatoes and stuff, I still think it's like what a wonderful other benefits we get from it, you know. And I think instilling that love of that network that's been so hidden and not talked about and suppressed as a science, actually for a very long time, the fungi are lumped with plants up
So
until
is
they
that
got their
where
own
my
kingdom.
is that where
in
my
this.
mulch disappears to? Is that where it gets eaten by all of those critters and
course, yeah.
creates? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
That's
really,
Literally the fungi are doing the job for the mulch. So
right.
that's
So we just
good.
keep
Keep
adding more
adding that
mulch,
mulch.
using the
Absolutely.
castings as the thing that you pop in when you put a new seed or a new
Yes,
plant in. So you're
absolutely.
constantly feeding the soil as well as
The other thing to keep in mind is because we live in a warmer place in Australia, and for people who live in subtropics and tropical areas, the turnover is way faster.
Faster.
So
Yeah.
because you have all that moisture, you need to have a lot more carbon that you're adding to the soil because it'll disappear faster.
That's
And
right.
so you have to be to really provide the soil benefits, you want to be adding lots of carbon to the soil.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's
okay,
been
that's a
one
good
thing
point.
that's, to be honest, that's one thing that's really missing in the worm farming world. And I've farmed, you know, because I didn't know anything about it back then. It wasn't like you could research anything. You just buy a worm farm and you know you put the worms in and you know you put the scraps in, you know. But once I started learning from Elaine Ingham, especially, like how important it is to have that carbon, how important the fungi are in the systems, because you can just have a worm farm where you just add food scraps, and I did for many, many, many years. And then I realized, and then I looked at it under the microscope. I was like, oh, but it's not as good as blah, 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 you know. And I was like, now I get why, because I've only been feeding like these sloppy foods and only bacteria grew, you know. And while,
sorry,
what are
I
you
just
gonna
want to
say?
add one thing. So here's the thing that I think is worth thinking about. So the reason subpod is different than other worm farms is because the walls are porous. And so what happens is the roots have a choice. They can actually enter their processes through the walls of the subpod, feed directly on the compost inside, and then they can also choose to feed and connect with the fungal processes in the garden bed. And so the nice thing is you're providing multiple food sources for the plants simultaneously. So if you add lots of carbon to the soil surface in the garden bed, you're preserving a lot of fungal activity in the bed itself. And then within the subpod, because it's permeable, the plant can feed both ways. And so I don't think you necessarily have to put all the carbon in the subpod, as long as you have it established in the garden bed. And I think a raised garden bed gives you an ideal context where you can do both and provide optimal environments, one for the microbes, the fungal microbes, and one for the bacterial microbes. Not that I'm saying be completely distinct, but in that way you can favor optimal growth conditions for each in those two
Yeah.
settings.
So then
And I
it brings
really,
sorry.
the only thing I would say about that is, you know, that I think the carbon, what it allows to do, like I've noticed, like I've gone to, you know, like troubleshooting, like what is it? It's a subpod page on Facebook, and I found a lot of people having this issue with you know, black soldier larvae being introduced, or smells and things like that. And I think this is where the carbon I love, because I've experienced those same issues, I would say, you know, because everything starts going anaerobic and we overwater things, and wet foods naturally will like sort of provide that. But if you just have, I just have this recipe now, like just add, even if it's paper waste, always add it to your, always the same. You're putting, and I worked in a subpod at work that I was running for a while when I was there before COVID and stuff, you know. I always made sure, no one else did, but I always made sure I added that organic matter that was carbon rich as well, because I knew the process by then that you need those both components, you know, because there's just not enough carbon in your apples and blah blah blah. But that also, and the reason for it is, as you're saying, you know, you can have the fungi in a different way introduced, but I still think people kind of get turned off by having sludge, you know. And
I'm not suggesting you
totally.
don't add lots and lots of carbon. Just I would say that the
just
carbon
balance
you're adding
it
to the subpod is much finer, much smaller, much more
yeah,
readily
you can't
broken
add
down.
but
And
even
so
in any worm farm system, I think
you don't want to be adding woody waste in subpod. So I think for people to
I
understand,
agree.
plenty of carbon, but use a really fine carbon that
I
breaks
agree.
down readily. Lots of surface area. That'll
That's
correct
right.
all of your problems in the subpod. It'll provide a readily available
Aeration.
source.
Yep, totally. That's exactly, I agree with that. So while you can put a bit of woody material on your garden bed as mulch, because it will last longer and it will cost you less and the fungi will slowly decompose it, definitely I agree with you that you've got you know, in a worm farm system, it's very difficult to add really hard carbon in no matter what the system is, because it would take so much longer than to get the castings, and you know, so it's very much balanced. And I think, like, even when I add carbon to my, you know, I don't go for the hardy stuff much, you know. That's more like long-term slower decomposition, like in this Johnson Sioux bioreactor that I told you about. That is all woody, and it takes years to decompose because the fungi takes so much longer.
Although you can totally add sawdust, so you can
I
add,
love sawdust.
you can add a carbon source that's almost pure cellulose with a little lignin in it. But if you pulverize it, there's lots of surface area. That's a really wonderful source of high carbon that breaks down readily. And so it's really it's so much about the surface area of the carbon you're providing that makes the difference.
And now I'm leaving my sawdust out to get little microbes hatching on it, because where I pick it up, there's a trailer. There's a guy. He leaves a trailer out. He's a woodworking guy, and he leaves a trailer out the front of his shed for gardeners to come, full of sawdust, so we can come in with our buckets and collect it. And it's underneath trees, so I'm sure that there's all these things now falling into the sawdust, which is
I think leaf litter is a really good source of everything, because, you know, because the leaf sits there for you know, some time, and then by the time it falls, it's full of endophytic fungi and other fungi that live inside the plant, you know, material itself. And then as they decompose, that changes the microbiology, but that's been sitting there absorbing all those microbes, you know, attaching them. And so adding that, and that really aerates your, you know, I would say, well, in a worm farming, conventional worm farming system, that is like one component that I wish I had known about, that to add that more just aeration, less
carbon,
just it's a balance. It's always and I think people, what I encourage people to do is experiment. You know, we're just giving you tips from our own experiments,
and see what
but
happens.
and just do it. Like, I didn't know that I could put eucalyptus leaves in my worm farm.
Well, that's Dan's question in the chat. He's asking about whether eucalyptus
very
bark
good
and
question.
leaves.
Well, you know what? Like, when I had the gutter gunk that I took out, now I'm adding that. I've just cleaned another gutter at another dwelling, and now I'm putting this in. And I experimented with it because I was a bit scared, but I knew it's been there for long enough that all the eucalypt, it doesn't smell like eucalypt anymore. You know, you can tell there's no deleterious essential oils that are actually really amazing, but yes, they can be quite antimicrobial. So you wouldn't want, you wait for that. So maybe, and I'm thinking maybe putting in like have just a spot where I can just keep moist in some sort of a bin situation, lots of leaves and stuff, and make my own little, like a pre-digester for them to use
wire cages. Don't they have those wire leaf litter?
You know, even a plastic bin is good because it'll keep the moisture in. You want to have the wire cages might dry out quickly, and so you want to have ideal moisture and airflow. And so
if you don't live in an area, yes. And so this bioreactor that's what we've made in a wire cage, but I have to water it. So you know, you either have to set up a little pump where it slowly pumps, or, as you say, just go and use a recycled bin of some kind that's already present, and you can.
Here's what I do at my place. So I'm lucky enough to have an area with huge trees overhead, constantly in shade, and so I deliberately put piles of woody chip down on the soil and let it sit there for half a year, and so it can start to break down. It actually, some of it becomes nice fine material, and then nearby you also have the leaf mulch layers. So
Yeah.
the thing when they studied the humic acids that form from pure leaf mulch, it's really a high grade
Yeah,
humic
which is
acid.
fungal food actually. So fungi
Exactly.
produce the humic acids and they also
Yeah.
consume them. That's why often people add humic acids to their soil and stuff. You know, it's quite interesting how that interaction occurs, and it is humus, and that's what fungi does.
Yeah.
Fungi do, they build the humus because of the humic and fulvic acids that they have in their cells, and that's also our carbon sequestration, isn't it? So really, I think through worm farming and doing these practices, having your own garden, if everyone does a little tiny bit, no matter how small, like if we all added up, if everyone did it and we removed our landfill, our food from our landfill, like literally we are sequestering carbon, you know. And I think that's because we're so obsessed with this carbon idea. It's like, well, we can all do something about it. We can, you know. And then if we support farmers that are doing the same thing, where they're not tilling and poisoning and spraying and adding artificial things, I think this is where I just like go, like, no, we have to take action as in like on individual basis. You know, we can't wait for governments to mandate stuff, which I think a lot of people are doing, like trying to get that, which is also important. It's more like, what can I do? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I just knew always that I couldn't put food in the bin. I just felt like, no, I don't want it to go and rot in some hole, you know. And then it's just a gut feeling, you know, like it came from nature. It's got to be back in nature. It's just these little things, I think, honestly, which each of us can change. You know,
Yeah,
we'll tell our children, we'll tell our neighbor, we go, hey, you know, do you want some of my worms? Can I share my worms with you? Will you have a worm farm? Like, honestly, I think it's just like grassroots, a beautiful, you know, in whichever
power to the
way we
people.
can add to the solution rather than the problem. I think it's
Yeah.
just lovely, you know.
Well, I mean, but see, I was always under the misconception that, you know, okay, I'm throwing my organic matter in the bin, it's going into that big hole in the ground and it's going to help break down everything else, not realizing that it was actually, once it goes
Unfortunately,
anaerobic, once it gets, you know, filled in, that it actually causes more destructive gases than if I, you know, even just, yeah. So that was
yes,
that was a wake up call
yes,
for me. And
Yeah.
it's a bit like this wake up call around not pulling my plants out of my garden soil now. It's like, this is a
yeah.
life-changing moment here.
Isn't
And
it
even
lovely? Because it's
weeds,
so
like, what do you reckon
simple as
about
well.
weeds? Leaving, like,
Yeah,
if I just cut
totally.
the
Look,
weeds off at the
yeah,
soil
yeah.
level
I
rather
think
than pulling them out?
what's really amazing as well is, which I've learned, of course, from Elaine as well, Elaine's work, is like weeds. This is this whole successional thing that I sort of talk about in the biodiversity stuff. When you have the beginning of earth, right, and then you've got just rock, that soil has to be created somehow. So bacteria initially are the ones that are doing all the breaking down, and then lichens, which use bacteria and fungi and, you know, cyanobacteria that can photosynthesize. You've got this now little ecosystem that's churning that. But as the bacteria dominate, they only produce nitrate, and which is really interesting. It's like it was a light bulb moment for me, like, why do weeds grow? But that tilling of soil, it takes you back to succession, to the beginning of succession. So every time we till, all the fungi die out, majority of them, bacteria dominate, pioneer species have to grow. To grow a crop, you need good already established ecosystem because it's a higher successional plant. Weeds are low succession. So as soon as you disturb, a weed has to come, because that soil, that life in the soil, the bacterial dominance cannot feed a plant that requires ammonium, which
Wow.
fungi produce.
Okay.
And the nitrate that the bacteria produce is perfect for these weeds. They just want to reproduce fast. It's a fast food. So the bacteria provide fast food, but every time you till, you kill, you know, bacteria are so tiny, they won't so much be killed out. Yes, they get exposed to the environment and, you know, they die. So you're lowering their biodiversity, but then you're even more back in succession. So you can think about it like we're taking it back every time we pull out, disturb the soil, poison it, or add chemicals to it of any kind. It puts it all back to success, like beginning of succession. So beginning of time. So then you got to build it all up again, and then you might support a crop or a tree, you know. But every time we do that and go back and take it back, that ecosystem is now poorer, and especially in the fungal component. And without the fungi, tree can't survive, because a tree needs the ammonium, which only the fungi provides. So it's so mathematically lovely, and there's literally one-to-one ratio of fungal biomass to bacteria. And that's what I do. I study under the microscope the ratios of these organisms and the numbers to tell me what I can grow. It's incredible. Like, so if you're a farmer and you want to grow wheat, there's already a formula for what you need to have in your soil to support that wheat. And then, and when you add that biology back, weeds disappear. So time and time again, the way to make weeds disappear, if you don't want them, I mean, they are doing a great job because we're selecting for their growth, and they are trying to replenish everything that's missing, and then they're dying. So they now putting everything up in succession, because that's the beauty of nature. It always has the right creature, the right organism, the right plant to be there at the exact conditions that have been created for it to grow. So for me, it's like so amazing because I'm like, wow, like I can just remove myself from that and just understand that every time something happens, there's a biological reason for it, and there's some sort of a disturbance. So I appreciate weeds very much. I understand that, some of them are very invasive and we need to manage them. But once again, I wouldn't be taking the root system out. And I know that means more work for people, but it also means that we will recover the system very much faster. So future generations don't have to do the weeding. That's my belief. And that's what I think needs to happen.
It's interesting. I used to always think that weeds were like, nature wants to fill a gap. It doesn't want to leave something exposed or soil, whatever.
That's right.
So it'll as you said, it's the species
that
to go in and colonize or be the first. I like that though, taking it back to the dawn of time.
The pioneering species.
That way, you're starting again.
Yeah, and I know a lot of them are introduced, but that's because we've introduced crops and animals to Australia where we don't, like in Australia, and I'm sure it's the same in the US, where we've got a lot of problems with weeds, but they almost have to be there to remediate the systems that they came from. Australian weeds couldn't cope, and in fact they can't cope in current damage. There were weeds for this when the soils were good here. Do you know what I mean? They can't even be weeds anymore. A lot of them have become extinct because the damage is so great and so oppressed by the introductions that now we have to rely on the weeds that have been introduced to do the remediative work. So we have to work with them. And I feel like if I was to I'm going to do some experiments at home. I've got a little of lantana. I'm going to chop and drop lantana, but you got to do it strategically so you're not spreading the seeds, and at the moment, to be honest, that's the only plant that actually flowers, and I appreciate it, but I also realize that, yes, if I want natives to grow back, I need to also manage that plant. So experimenting with that and using it to our advantage, because lantana under the soil has got amazing soil is created, always. And then little shoots for the natives start growing. It's a very much understanding what you're working with.
Like my bush regeneration friends, they say that it's a nursery plant, and that they clear it, like sometimes just clear a little gap in amongst it to put the new tree until the tree can grow up, and then and it also creates home for birds and other things that add to the whole cycle. So
butterflies are being fed. There's always when I look at a lantana plant, there's always spiders hunting. That means lots of creatures are visiting it, So it's really, I think every plant has a role, and even if they're introduced, they're already here. How do we manage them without poisons? How do we in our gardens, like for example, if you're having, like a lot of people ask me like, oh, but I've got snails in my gardens and I'm growing this amazing food and there's snails eating everything, or there's that creature comes. The thing is, what we don't realize is plants, when they're not happy, when the microbiome is disturbed, when they've been put back in succession, the environment they live in, they basically they literally produce alcohols and signal to creatures that fly by, eat me. A locust will never land on a healthy plant. The chemical signature the plant is giving off makes it taste bad for it. The specific compounds the plant produces when it's sick and it's asking, please decompose me, and for a good reason. Those creatures then come, decompose it, poop out all the nutrients from that plant, and now fertilize and put the soil up in succession, and now another plant can grow. So you see, like we think, oh, well, look at this pest decimating our monoculture crop. It's doing what it's asked to do through nature's laws to bring succession up, to allow for crops to grow.
The other part of that story is that you breed plants to be productive, and so they lose some of their defenses, so they put less energy into protecting themselves.
Money.
And so, but it's also, if you're going to grow food crops, you're entering into a relationship with that plant the plant says, look, I'll give you lots of productive food, but you have to take care of me because I've been bred to produce lots of food and I'm dependent on you to take care of me. And so that's something to keep in mind when you're growing beautiful heirloom tomatoes or anything else that's been grown for hundreds of years in human cultivation, is you've kind of created a pact where you have to help each other out. Wild plants have a different deal. They're survivors. They'll manage fine with the pests, but it's
It's
I
very
would say
much true.
there's not too many plants that you grow for food that don't need some care and attention to protect them from predation, because they've probably chemically evolved away from putting as much energy into defense, and because more of it is selected for higher production, they're putting it into food generation for us.
Yes, exactly. And so once again, it's like we need to look at this relationship between ourselves and plants, and our relationship to you know, sort of this attitude that we just expect the things, expect that we have to outsmart nature in a way, you know. And I understand that if we just like sort of understood her better and worked with her systems, even if those plants are dependent on us to start with, even the mycorrhizal fungi being introduced back into the system, and we're not disturbing that, something's dependent on us, but also we realize, well, I can just be the custodian and be the sort of you know, the person that gives to the system, but doesn't give in a way where it's to control it so much. Do you know what I mean? Like almost like allowing things to work with like work with them. And even the weeds discussion we just had, how can I work with this? It's growing, nature's saying this plant belongs there, and I'm saying it doesn't. Like we're not looking at the causes, and you're saying the cause here in this plant human relationship is very much that we made it dependent. Like, you know, every time we give fertilizer, the fungi go, I can't stay here now, I'm being poisoned, and the plant literally kicks them out because they're like, well, this human's giving me this free junk food, which is so expensive to produce, and like I'm gonna get rid of all these creatures because I don't need them anymore. There's literally all of these dynamics happening. The communication system is insane.
So those liquid fertilizers that you buy, like, you know, those you know, fish emulsions and seaweed solutions.
That's okay. Fish
that's not
emulsion
true. Yeah, that's okay. It's more like, you know, the chemical fertilizers,
the NPKs and all of that.
yes, everything that's made through, you know, extraction of ground oil, and literally like, and then we're gonna phosphate is almost out, like, you know, that these are chemicals that are being mined to put on the soils, and also the plants can't really take them up much, so they get run off into our waterways, producing pollution. There's so many issues where the microbiology will just solve it. And so I feel so passionate about talking to farmers and going, donate and let us, the community, with our worm castings, regenerate your crop, your soil, and see whether that brings you better benefit, and you don't have to spend money on fertilizers and chemicals. You know, the
So
Giving
this is
Soil
this Giving
thing
Soil initiative that you're working
yeah
on. Actually,
like it's a, maybe it's a like a far-fetched idea, but I have a faith that in, you know, if we can all work with that and take responsibility for that patch of land that that farmer might donate, and we as a community or someone that has that passion can go and say, look, I'm going to spray this on your land, just please don't till and poison for a while, and see how it works. Imagine
so
if
donating
there
worm
was,
castings would help.
that's exactly what I'm asking for. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Basically these worm farms, these flow through worm farms, the worm flow thing is where you wait for that fungal biomass to come back, but then there are a few people already interested where they want to donate that. So local growers in every community, you know, you could be producing, like, rather than going to the farmer where you've got to have a big worm farm, you know, and that's great if they would, but also like, well, I'm eating this food, I'm buying it, I want it clean, I don't want it to be with pesticides, and, you know, how about I can contribute? And how can I contribute? I can grow this amazing, use the worms and cultivate the microbes, and then pull it together, and then we go to the farmer and we go, okay, let's spray this on your land, or let's add it to your land, and you just have to, you can still harvest maybe for a premium price because now you've got clean food growing, you know. There's all these opportunities.
Okay. We might have to add that to our Grow Hub, where people, once they've been composting for a while and don't have, especially people in the cities who go, well,
yes,
what do I do with my castings?
Yes, and you know what it's doing.
The castings are gold. There's lots of ways of using castings, but I would also say it's always better to take a systems approach to really take the whole picture into account. So as much as Sandra is advocating, and I think it's a great idea, bring the complex soil biology back in places where it's been impoverished, it's good to be growing those green cover crops as a collaborative impact. So I would say that between harvest crops the farmer is planting, you put in some great green manure crops that then help with the soil, because the whole thing about tilling was that people didn't realize when you produce bare ground, that's when all the problems start.
Yes.
And so by adding in green manure, green cover crops, you're basically connecting the dots between the soil biology and growing plants. And the three of those can work together very synergistically.
And to be honest, like I was just thinking about subpod and the gardens people have, you could do the same in your garden. You could grow some low level green manure that's constantly there while your plants that you harvest. And you know what? There's no competition.
Yeah.
Because
So what
everyone
kind of
has
ones would you suggest? Like,
No,
what kind of,
this is the cover crops. And so, for example, you look at companion planting relationships between different plants. So I have citrus in my garden, and I learned from a permaculturist that there's a plant called dogsbane, which grows around citrus, which provides a green cover, so it keeps the soil from being bare, but it actually increases the productivity of your citrus.
mm-hmm.
So you start to learn and share with people knowledge about companion plants, say green cover crops with your trees as one example, and you can find
Absolutely.
that works great. So if you find, just as a principle, if you find cover crops for existing trees, you want things with a very sort of shallow root system, so it's not competing with the plant roots, but it's providing a cooler soil, it's providing shade for that soil biology, and probably providing some sugars secreted from its
Oh,
roots.
well, definitely. So
Yeah.
that's why when you know, even if you have a like a permanent perennial cover crop in agricultural systems, and Elaine Ingham is working with farmers doing both those things, adding the biology, but also ensuring that that biology is fed. Because once again, it's all about feeding your biology. When you harvest and you pull out and you take the organic matter out, biology dies. You have to inoculate again. It's more expensive. So what you end up doing is having like this workforce of plant constantly being present. And Christine Jones' work, if you guys want to look her up, she's an Australian pioneer in this area. Like she's like Gabe Brown in America, you know, she's
what's
all
her
about
name?
working. Christine Jones, Dr. Christine Jones. So she works with farmers, showing like how the plant families, the different plant families, when they're from different families and they're growing together, they never compete. They're always supporting each other. So like you have your legumes, you have your grasses, you have your what are they called, forbs, you know, the like leafy, broader leaf. And if you have all of those together, there's never competition. Once again, in a forest, you don't see competition. Everything's biodiverse and growing even more. They want more plants to grow around them. It's lovely. And it's the systems in our agriculture can go that way. And I agree with you, Peter. And I think like without that, that's like another step. Do you know what I mean? It's like you got to start somewhere. If you just go, okay, let's just get rid of the chemicals first. And then we work with the farmers and go, okay, like, well, this works. These guys have shown that this works. Let's try it. And we've done a trial. I've done a trial with a farmer. Healthy Land and Water supported us financially. And we did that. We did a monocrop and a cover crop, and we put biology, and we did control and treatment with biology for both. Like, you know, we grew a compost heap and we had worm farm, and then I looked at it under the microscope and we're like, yep, let's inoculate it. And of course, with no rain, heat, we were under pressure. We had to get the crop in, even though there was no rain for months. What ended up happening is I was like, it's a flop. But someone came with a drone, like a company, and they tested and they basically did like a spectral sort of analysis. And it showed that where the biology was applied to the seed, the chlorophyll content was way better, like way more. You can see it. It's an image, you know. And we're like, wow. And of course, when the rain hit, the crops started growing like crazy just in the biological treatment. And the yield was increased by 35% in those plants that were treated with the biology. And all I saw, even though under the microscope, I couldn't see much difference, what I realized is in the root microbiome, the roots, it wasn't the soil that was improving yet, because it was just such a quick, you know, few applications, or seeds really got the application, and really the soil got very little because of failure of, well, there was no water, there's all these things happening. But what's interesting is the quorum sensing, the organisms were communicating, and biodiversity increased just within the root, and fungi were in the root. And I was like, wow, you know, honestly, something that felt like it was complete failure because of the conditions. Those 8 cover crops together, the millet died, so that was the monocrop. Those guys just went crazy. It was beautiful. I was like, wow, you know, it really showed me the power of communication between microbes, our love of, our desire to provide biodiversity, and just all of those things communicating together, working together. It created something that was a surprise in the worst of conditions, 40-degree heat, no water, palm failures, everything went wrong. And the only thing that went right was the compost and the fact that we applied it to the seed, you know, and the worm castings. How crazy is that? You know,
Yeah,
like it really builds your
that's a great result. Yeah. You know,
yeah.
there was and you're reminding me of an example. I heard about a farmer who's planting a cover crop supply on his plants every year, and he had field. Typically, he get these bags with 8 different species in them. In 1 year, he had small amounts of a bunch of bags left over, and he figured out it was about 30 different species. He put them all on. It was like your conditions, drought and really tough conditions. He got the very best yield ever because of the diversity. So that principle of diversity keeps
Can't go
multiplying.
wrong.
So you go from 8 to 30, and all of a sudden you have synergy.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, there's a genetic repertoire in all those 30 different species. So they're able to adapt and take advantage of micro differences in weather and support each other, as you say, in quorum sensing. And so there's a resilience you're building into the system with greater diversity. And so when people think about cover crops, go crazy, add
That's
even
right.
more diversity.
Yeah. And you know what's funny about that quorum sensing thing is, like, from my understanding, it's like there's signals in the ecosystem that it's okay for those dormant species, or the genes that haven't even been expressed, and the potentials of these organisms, when there's more of these other organisms saying this is safe now almost, or this is now the time for us to switch on those genes, things just go crazy. And we don't even, and they're tiny little organisms, you think, like, but they're so complex because of the genetic makeup being allowed to flourish all of a sudden. You know, it's like you're allowing your plants to grow well. Do you know what I mean? It's the same thing, like when you provide those conditions, it's all about conditions. And I think if we keep like few things in mind, like the biodiversity, you know, the non-disturbance, and the biological helpers being put in, like your plants will just go, yeah, like this is it for me. I can just now relax, you know, I can grow. And I think that's just like few little simple things we can just think about as principles and keep them to bring it back to our garden, you know, to bring it back to the subpod, like giving that extra, not just your sludge foods, but also, you know, because often there's this feeling, like for me definitely has been, that my worm farm is just somewhere I put my waste into, you know. Whereas it changed once I started having that relationship with the worms and now the microbes. I'm like, wow, had I known that when I was actually doing my PhD on fungi, but I wasn't connecting that to my own worm farm, you know, this is the thing. We don't connect the dots. But then when it all comes together, you're like, okay, it takes a while. It took me like almost 20 years to get back to the worm farm and actually look what's in there. And, you know, all the other creatures that are there.
Carbon and air, you know.
Yeah. And the other creatures that are there, you know, like, you know, often people freak out at the soldier fly larvae. Well, you know, those big maggot things, but they're so good as well at decomposing things that the worms might not necessarily love, because you know, in your worm farm, there might be a pocket that's anaerobic. So they come in and they do the job. So never freaking out at what's there, but also looking at it. I got ants. Well, okay, it's too dry in there, you know, just sort of working with it and observing and watching. Like, have I got cockroaches? That's great. Like, I've got bush cockroaches, and I love them being in there because they're shredding the hardier organic matter as well. So they're all working in unison in my farm. I don't go, oh, you guys shouldn't be there, because who am I to decide what, you know, I've created the conditions for them to be there. Do you know what? It's like kind of like really cool, because then you're like, oh, I'm selecting for these guys to be there. Are they good? Like, yeah, it looks like everything's working.
Yeah,
you
really,
know?
the way I look at that is I see some of these guys telegraph signals of what's going on, but ultimately it's only an issue if it's a problem for the worms. And so in
That's
some
right.
cases, they're giving you a message, hey, this is going to be hard on the worms, maybe change those
Yeah.
conditions. But
Yeah.
otherwise, it's true, live and let them all work together to collaborate in breaking down the waste.
Yes, and if you've got a lot of insects in there, yes, that might suggest a little bit of, you know, it might be too dry. It just depends. And, you know, but it might not be, because in an area that you live, that organism actually likes that, you know, and that's also good for the worms. So once again, you're just looking at your health of your worms. And for me, it's always going back to, because, you know, that's what I do. Like, I look at it under the microscope, and that tells me straight off, you know, what is going to, like, what's happening in that system. Oh, I've got ciliates. I didn't even talk about these little, I probably, if you guys want me to introduce the team, there's only a few players in it, but we talked about fungi. We kind of talked about bacteria being the most nitrogen rich, and we don't, you know, producing nitrate instead of ammonium. So we talked about them. But there's also the ciliates, or the organisms, sorry, the protozoa, which are the tiny unicellular organisms that eat like 10,000 bacteria a day. So they're pooping out plant nutrients, and we need lots of them, you know. And there's different types. There's flagellates with big swimming tail, a flagellum, and then there's also amoebae, you know, the amoeba, the blob, and there's ones that make little shells out of they're called testate, but they make a little shell around them from the mineral particles in the soil or the compost. And these guys, they eat so much of the bacteria, we need them. And the nematodes, which are the tiny worms, they also eat the, you know, the protozoa and the bacteria. So then they're getting more diversity, they're pooping out more food for your plant. But some are indicator species, like you're saying, Peter, where, you know, you when you notice one thing happening, like the ciliates, which are these beautiful one cellular organism creatures, but they like stagnation, they like dropped oxygen conditions. So when you have them in your worm farm, you're like, it's anaerobic, it's going anaerobic. If they're there in abundance, you know, you can, you know, so once again, you're picking up on cues, and the microscope is the easiest in a way, even though it might be more difficult, but it's really quick way of looking at, I can just chuck it under and go, oh, right, this is what's going on. You know, so it's a lovely, if you're working with someone that like needs to know these things, like producers, you can let them know like what is going on, you know. And hopefully one day, like I hope that part of like what I do in the future will be like running microscopy courses so people can get involved, going to schools. I really want to go to schools and teach kids about these microbes, these families of all these organisms playing together, eating each other, but also actually just, you know, really collaborating with the plant, just so they're aware that these things exist, because we don't see them. If we don't see them, we don't think about them. But when we understand that they are the ones that we need to care for our plants to grow, I feel like what a wonderful way that can be done with what technology can offer now these days, you know, like microscopy is so, 20 years ago, you couldn't just, not anyone could just have a microscope perhaps, you know. Now it's incredible what's out there. And I just encourage people to get more interested in the soil life, because literally, I think it is where we need to go to put back what we've taken out of it from the atmosphere back into the soil, and to allow plants grow, because that's what, you know, plants are really what gives us oxygen, food, shelter from wood. We need to grow back plants. And I think it starts with the garden, but then you can think about it outside of the garden and how the world can be a garden, you know. We
Yeah,
can
which is
be a worm
interesting.
farm and a garden. Literally,
because
the
I
world can
know
be a
that,
worm farm.
like Sadi was said to me, you know, when I was traveling over Europe, you know, there's the big thing that's out there now is bringing biodiversity back into the cities as well. So it's not just
Absolutely.
about a large scale garden. It's like anywhere that we can bring biodiversity, any form of greening the planet, whether it be, as I said, a little pot plant or a little raised garden bed on a balcony or in the cracks in the pavement, you know, just yeah,
Yes.
anything that's going to
Yes.
keep those microbes, bacteria, and fungi alive on this planet, to help, you know, to keep that side of life, which
Absolutely.
we're only just starting to understand the
That's right.
complexities and of it
And you
now.
know, with genetic analysis now, we can know, like, we can test for species. It takes time and stuff. I think it's so much easier if you just follow those principles we've discussed. And you know, Peter keeps talking about his garden and how he does it, and learning from others. Even if you don't understand that that's all there, it's good to understand, I think, because then you know what you're doing and your intention is different, you know. If it's not just about I want to eat that plant, you know, if it's beyond that,
Yeah.
I just want that for myself.
Once you
They're just
understand the
observing
basic,
and
sorry.
sharing. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, once you understand basic principles, you can apply them.
Yes.
So one revelation for people is thinking about, if it does rain, the reason you want to have the right soil structure is to hold all that water. So what does that mean? Well, it means a soil structure that allows a lot of porosity. It'll either hold air or water. And the beautiful thing about it is it's the same in both cases, where you can do a simple test where you put a little PVC pipe into your soil, hammer it in, pour water in, and watch how fast it infiltrates into the ground. It'll give you immediate feedback on how good your soil structure
Mm-hmm.
is, and ways to improve it are growing those plants and growing the microbes. But the cool thing is that how does the rain in basically absorb into that soil? It's because there's a lot of airspace before it gets there, so there's plenty of places for it to go. And if the soil
Mm-hmm.
structure is good, whatever rain falls away doesn't take any dissolved soil with it. So one of the tragedies here is when we had all the flooding and they measured the height of the river, they figured out that 2 feet or roughly about you know, it was 14 meters high in one place. So almost 2 meters of that was actually dissolved soil.
That's so sad, isn't it?
So
Because
you're
that's a,
losing thousands of years
yeah,
of biology
yeah.
results in those flooding events. And so it's the sort of thing where the stronger and more resilient you can make the soil, the better.
Yes, and it's all those microbes that produce all those glues that make those air pockets and the hyphal
Mhm.
fung, you know, hyphae hold on to that soil. Like that's why when you have mulch on top, you can even see it. Sometimes you pick it up and it is just incredible. And what lives in it, you can see it with your naked eye, you know. It's that ground cover, it's those plants, those roots holding things together. Yes.
Yeah, I
And I
can't
think
bear to see bare soil. I see bare soil. I was like, no,
yeah,
Like a
it's like
worm.
it's getting
very
sunburned
sad.
or something. It's like,
Yeah, and it
cover it up
is.
quick.
Yeah. And compaction, and then every time rain
Yeah,
drops on it, it compacts it. And even
yeah.
like the rainforests around here when it flooded as well, when I looked at some, you know, under the microscope what was happening, and it, like literally the organisms were gone. They were like washed out, and because
Wow.
it went under flood for so long and it went anaerobic, you know,
Mhm.
because it stood underwater for so long, it shouldn't, that forest would have drained and absorbed, but because of the situation it's in, and it's like a remnant pocket, just the farms, how it just ended up in that spot, you know. The floods just, of course it will regenerate, but sometimes when these flood events are and drought events alternate, and over time trees do weaken, and you know 300-year-old Moreton Bay fig trees died as a result, you know, over time.
So
And
this
then we,
anaerobic versus aerobic
yes,
versus anaerobic. I mean, obviously anaerobic. Yeah. Have you
no
studied
oxygen.
what's the difference between what's happening in nature and the, you know, is there a benefit of anything anaerobic, or is it just
Anaerobic is what happens when you don't have aerobic conditions. So basically, that's what
Lack of
happens first in
oxygen, yeah.
nature. So when the Earth
interesting?
evolved, before there's an oxygen atmosphere, you evolved anaerobic organisms. And so in conditions where you're depleting for oxygen, they come back into focus. You have some classes of organisms that are facultative aerobics. So they'll switch gears and become anaerobic when you don't have oxygen around, but it's less beneficial from our point of view for the kind of life we're interested in promoting to have anaerobic conditions,
Mhm.
because you end up producing metabolites and chemicals that aren't necessarily favorable to the conditions we want to support.
Right.
And plants, remember, plant roots need oxygen.
Yeah.
So if we remove oxygen from the soil because we have created lifeless soils, that's once again going back to succession, weeds will grow, because weeds are going to try to break that. A lot of weeds, like, they either hold soil moisture, and they could just be an introduced plant of any kind. They're not necessarily like weeds that came, you know, there's agricultural weeds, there's environmental weeds, but when you study the plant like lantana, they've got 5 meters of root. I found recently, I took a video of 5 meters, you know. So when you think about it from that perspective, once again, some plants will just start breaking up that pan, you know, they'll start, you know, they've got a taproot. And the thing is, when you create these compaction based conditions in the soil, the anaerobic conditions, the plants that you're trying to grow cannot even get through. The roots should be really long. Most plants have really long roots, but they just can't, especially the crop I'm talking about, plants, you know, like grasses that need to go and extensively, but have to go sideways. There's a tilled pan underneath. This is how soils are normally. You've only got that much soil to grow in. If that, you know, you got to discover where that is. The infiltration of water is not getting in there. It's either running off completely after, like when it's so dry, the water just runs off. It doesn't even absorb, you know, there is no infiltration. It's like a, but the oxygen, when the oxygen's missing, the plants just can't, well, not only because they need oxygen, to a certain level of oxygen, but also those organisms that provide immunity and feeding can no longer withstand those conditions. So you can see it, you start getting root feeding nematodes that are eating, they're basically eating the plant because the plant is sick, and they're surviving in conditions that are low oxygen based. When the conditions change and all the other microbes are present, they eat all those creatures that are trying to eat your plant. They're not trying, they just signal to eat it. But once again, see, the conditions create everything, don't they?
Right.
You've got the oxygen, you can't have the root eaters, you can only have the good beneficial stuff. It's amazing, like literally, like how, what came first, do you know what I mean? But we know from what Peter was saying at the beginning of time, there was no oxygen, then oxygen came, then light came, and then you've got the bacteria starting to do their job, and then as they die, they produce some organic matter, and then a little lichen grows and then dies, and you know, it's this constant chain reaction of amazing processes. And yes, in anaerobes, as you, Kathryn, asked, it's like like I have stagnant water at home so I can observe them, because to me they're very interesting because they move a lot. Like their ciliates are incredible. They've got charisma and they one cell organism. Like I love watching them eat and run and interact with each other. So I actually almost create these conditions, not in the soil, but stagnant water. I can't throw it out because I'm like, I've got to look at it under the microscope, because under the pot plant, what is swimming in that anaerobic cesspool? And often the most
Oh, my
interesting
poor
things are
thing.
in there, but I love it,
Well,
because
how about at the bottom level, the 3-tier worm farm in that lowest chamber where it's liquid? A lot of that's pretty
that
anaerobic.
would be in there.
Mm.
Yeah. And I mean, it might even stink and be gross, but to me, it's
Yeah.
still beautiful because I get this joy out of it by looking at these amazing monsters under the microscope. And, so nothing's bad, but for your plant, as Peter said, it's what do we want? We want a plant, so a plant can't survive those conditions, So, yeah. And so that's the bottom line, like create the conditions that your plant needs. And we know scientifically now that, there's specific ratios of fungi to bacteria that you want for a particular crop. There's and they all have different requirements. Even like cannabis, for example, I've learned recently, that fungal to bacterial biomass ratio, when you're growing like medicinal cannabis or even hemp, depending on the chemical you want the plant to produce, it requires a different fungal to bacterial ratio. So like if you want to produce cannabinoids that are like for, say, medicinal purposes, like CBD oil and stuff, that's going to require different biological ratios of organisms, as opposed to if you want to produce THC for a specific, pain or whatever. And that's interesting as well to me, that even the same family of plants, depending on the chemical expression that you want, you need to manipulate that if that's what you want, Of
Or
course, in our
provide
garden, we just want
make it
food.
accessible.
Yeah, it's interesting, very interesting. It's all so
It's
fascinating.
also interesting. And look at all this talk about plants, and it's getting me hungry for food. But anyway,
And we are
I just thought, look, before we wrap it up, and it's like, I know you guys could talk day and night
Whatever.
about this stuff. I just wanted to check if Dan and Morel had any questions that they wanted to bring forward, and they can either put them in the chat or just unmute themselves. There's Dan.
Yeah, getting back to the eucalyptus bark in the trees, I think Peter commented on putting chunks of bark or leaves in a bucket, perhaps wetting it a bit, letting it sit for a while to get rid of the oils. Is that what
Yeah,
you're
so
saying, Peter?
Dan, what I would just say is you're supporting the breakdown of that, because in its raw state, when the leaves are fresh and the bark is new, that can be a little toxic for a worm system, but it's easy to mature it and ripen it so it is a good medium to put into the subpod. And the best way to do that is give it moisture and give it air. And so and if you don't want to be tending it all the time, I was suggesting a bucket, because it'll hold the moisture better than if you have it in a wire cage. But I would make sure that if it's filled to the top, you give it a stir or move it around a bit, because you'll facilitate its breakdown faster if you make sure air gets to it as well as moisture.
You can
Right.
even drill
So-
holes and into your bin as well. You can experiment with like how air
Yeah.
gets in there, and as long as you've got a lot of because obviously you're talking about leaves, there's a lot of air there, but to not compress it too much. But the moisture is so important in that for the fungi, because fungi are going to be the ones eating your leaves, eventually.
And the cool thing I've noticed is in my areas where I put in piles of woody chip, of course, the earthworms discover it and they move all the way through it, and they're providing a lot of wonderful aeration of that, and of course seeding it with microbes and fungi and everything. So yeah, if you have a reasonable amount of it in reasonable space, you can actually be building a wonderful woody mulch to put around your perennial trees, and they'll love it.
Okay, so a good rule of thumb to find out if it's ready to use as mulch or compost is if the scent of the eucalyptus is gone.
That's a good test. Yeah.
Okay.
Sandra, would you agree with that? If you don't smell any of those eucalyptus oils anymore, and if it's a bit crumbly in your hand, it's not stiff and hard anymore.
Yeah, and moist, and it looks broken down and smells like leaf mulch rather than like eucalyptus. Yeah, it will take a while, but as Peter says, the more you sort of excuse me, like sort of work with it in the sense of like it's moist, that it's turned doesn't have to be, because you can just leave it, but it will take longer. And I think the less, well, little tiny twigs are good in there as well, you know, not just leaf, because, and that probably naturally happens when you rake it up, because those twigs will provide, once again, aeration, you know. So I think just experiment with it. But yeah, eucalyptus, something that's been sort of like shunned, but it can be like really used to our advantage. And there's a
Okay.
lot of plants like that, you know, that we sort of go, oh no, that's got poisons. Every plant has got some sort of a chemical in it, you know, that we don't eat, sort of like.
Right. That's
So,
like the comments about weeds, not to pull them out, but to just cut them off at the soil line. The roots dig tunnels for other stuff.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and they're covered in microbes that are, you know, that are there for the plant that you might want to, eventually that will be like passed on if the plant dies, you know. So even
Right.
if you cutting it down because you want to get rid of it, a lot of it will regrow. But imagine if you just chopped and dropped all the time and use it as a live, like a mulch, you know, and then you can use that mulch in that little bin system and put your scraps in there, and then you're just creating this amazing biodiversity. That's an experiment we all could do in our backyard, you know.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks,
No
Bennett.
worries.
Now, Morel, looks like you've unmuted. Did you have a question for Sandra before I start winding this
Well, I
up?
did. I did earlier about, you know, the nursery sold me heaps of supposed beautiful soil, just perfect for raised beds. It was terrible. However, today, just listening, I thought, well, I'm not, well, definitely not buying any more, but instead of focusing on putting more mulch on, but I'm going to have to stop pulling those weeds out because I've got that oxalis everywhere. I hate it.
Can you use the oxalis? I don't even know what it is, but could you
Yeah,
do a
I know
similar thing?
oxalis. Oxalis looks like clover. It's similar.
Yes, beautiful
oxalis.
yellow flowers. When we were little, when we used to
Mm.
walk to school, you could suck it, you know, sort of soury,
Edible.
soury. Yeah, it's not poison, but it's it's very
Cool.
prolific.
Yeah.
But I don't know what else you can do with it. So, but it does
Yeah.
seem to be. So obviously, having weeds there tells me that the other things.
You might want to consider, if you've already put it into the garden beds, is put in some annual grasses and let them grow really tall, and they'll basically block out the soil, the oxalis, which grows at a very low level, and so it won't get the light anymore.
Yes, I've got very tall weeds in my paddock, which is just too wet to cut down. So
I just wonder how we could, like, you know, work with those weeds in a way that whether like building that soil profile a little bit through extracts of your worm castings, even, you know, that's another thing we haven't really talked about, but you can literally just put in a mesh bag, you know, your castings from your worm farm, and then massage out the microbiology very gently into in a bucket of water, and then spray that on, you know, because then when you're increasing the biodiversity, some of those weeds might not like it. And yes, they might proliferate sometimes as well, but other things will grow because your microbiology in that soil is obviously poor, as you're saying. And of course, like this oxalis, if it's like a clover, it's probably nitrogen fixing.
It is.
It's also fixing the soil at the same time, you know. So maybe like mowing it and allowing it to go through its process, and then so it no longer becomes a thing. Do you know what I mean? It's like kind of like pushing succession forward, like forcing the plant out by improving the conditions. That's how I'm looking at it. As in, like, because that's a plant that probably doesn't have really deep roots. If it's a clover and it does this whole
it has like
matting,
little bulby, so they're not quite bulbs. They're
probably nitrogen nodules.
Yes, probably.
Is that what you said, Peter?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't studied it in general, but yeah, it has the telltale bulbs in it that could be the.
Yes, yeah, they're like, and it's like the yellow flowers. It's not the pink. It's not the pink ones. Yeah.
Right.
I've got the pink ones here. I was just pulling out today. I'm like, oh,
since the rain, since we've had all the rain.
Does it grow high, or is it like a ground cover?
Probably, I don't know, so, max might be 10 or 11 inches.
That's actually, you know, let's just work with that, because maybe what you can do is plant as Peter suggested, but maybe choose plants that you would like to grow in that, and something that rises above it, because that could be your perennial cover crop that's already doing its job.
Okay.
Depending on what you want to use the paddock for, you know, because it might not be a problem, even though it's covering everything. Other plants that grow taller might still live within that, because they won't compete. Because if you don't plant a legume, because that's already doing a leguminous job, fixing nitrogen, plant something in there and see what happens, because you might actually not want to get rid of it if you think about like the fact that this is a ground cover that's constantly there, but you can diversify it, you know, add other things. So do you know what you want to do with that paddock? Like what's
Nothing at the
around?
moment. I want to grow trees in one part of it. I want to have a little orchard, not a big one. But, you know, the front end of it is, I'm too old to be growing. My dad used to, you know, plant everything there. He'd have rows of tomatoes and corn and all sorts of things. Well, now it's just a weed haven.
It's not a bad thing, you know, like if you just look at it, that it's got some biodiversity of plants already, and that some of them are fixing nitrogen, like trees might eventually love that place. So maybe just planting right into that might prove that it actually works.
Okay, that's
and maybe
not a bad
inoculate your, you know, your
okay.
plant, your tree with your worm farm castings, you know, allow that, or even just dip them in the solution of worm farm castings and see how it goes. Just experiment and let us know.
Because I had to have this idea that I had to clear it, you see, so now I don't.
No.
You
know
what
what I'd suggest also is just do experiments like even Kathryn, when she sees her oxalis, is try to have the same plant with the oxalis and the one without it, and notice, does it actually suffer or does it benefit possibly? And so you can actually get real feedback and learn, let your plants teach you what they like and don't like, and just kind of gather information. That's the best farmers, just observe and attend and notice, you know, what
I love that.
Well.
Yes, that sounds really good. Anyway, Dr. Tushinkar, thank you so much.
No worries, you're welcome. I'm so glad we had the little chat, and it's so good to have you guys on board and ask good questions. And Peter's knowledge is, you know, just I love, like when we exchange that information, we can think outside the box, you know, like ideas pop up, and I love that about communicating in this, you know, like on a common goal for the good of the planet and also our own gardens, you know, starting in our own little backyards and going further and thinking, well, if I can make a little patch of goodness in mine and understand things better and work with them rather than against them, what will that mean? How can I then tell my neighbors, and how can the neighbors tell the other neighbors, and how can one country tell the other country? That's how I see it.
That's right, and that's a good thing. And I've, a bit like you, always can't bear to see waste. Don't, you know, and think, what can you do with all these things? So, you know, even just burying the food scraps is sort of one thing, but to put them in the worm farm, in the subpod, is you know, is much better. But then listening about because I had heard about putting in torn up bits of cardboard, but when you're saying putting in the leaf mold so that's a good idea too.
Yeah, anything count. And you know, a little bit of that clover in your worm farm might also change things. Like even I'm thinking outside the box now.
It's a bit.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's like sour sauce. We used to call
eat it.
Sour sauce. Yeah, it's like sour sauce. It's not unpleasant. It's just sort of suck the stems and.
Oh, I love it when you're kids and you just like go for like these things.
I know.
Think of
there was the other one too that had the little bobbly thing that we used to eat.
Well, there is something
off the mallow, some kind of mallow. Yes, if that's the one you're talking about.
Now you're bringing back memories of, you know, lawn at school.
And that was whatever that was. That was very nice.
We
probably really good for us. It was probably all that.
The nectar spurs from two things: impatience, because they have a pretty good nectar store, and then of course honeysuckle.
Yes, yeah, that's
right. I think I ate a caterpillar or two when I was a kid. Anyway, hanging out in the garden, thankfully I did, and it was probably what's kept me alive into this point. All those bacteria and microbes keeping me healthy. But
the microbiome gets inoculated, doesn't it, through all those plants? It all travels up the plant from the soil, and then some of them are our friends in our own gut. So it's incredible.
Yeah,
that's a whole other conversation. The gut health. I must get Peter Howard actually to do a conversation about that. There's a lot of great information coming out about the micro gut.
Yeah.
And then growing your own food.
It's kind of early days on that subject. Sandra was alluding to the tools of sequencing, and so now you're at the state of the art where, you know, there are basically thousands of candidate microbes, but the relationships between them have to be elucidated. So in a way, there's people are getting into trouble already by trying to create bad actors and good actors, and it's actually a more sophisticated subject where
Totally.
you actually want to favor an interplay. It's the same principle of you want diversity.
Biodiversity. Always, always, always.
Varied diet.
But anyway, we
Yeah.
could definitely share the basic principles that are recognized, and then take people to the edge where there's a lot to be elucidated.
Yeah, take them to the edge. Well done. Now, look, I do have to mention that
Yes.
Matt Elbs, he was asking about a Soil Life for Dummies book. I'm going to share your link to your site,
Yep.
which I hope will give him some information because you didn't have an actual he tried reading Teeming with microbes that found it too dense and academic.
Yes.
So I'm just going to
Yeah.
share
So
those
I might
links.
just say that this is going to be my, like, it's my thing to like sort of keep talking about these things, give presentations going up on YouTube on those. If people are interested, they can go to the Giving Soil Coda doc, which is my page. And if you Google my name, Giving Soil, and the word coda, you don't even have to use the word coda, but you'll find that I'm putting I'm going to put like a blog or articles about all of these already organisms. I've already done one on that.
In layman's terms, not in science
Yeah, in
terms.
like almost a kid like a level, from a
Right.
fairy tale perspective, because it is a fairy tale and it is beautiful, and with pictures, so you get to see
Right.
what they look like and what they do, and that's a very basic.
And the video of the worm nematode pooping.
Oh, I've got it somewhere. I'm gonna have to start putting them up. Next year is my year of putting all of those videos of microscopy work
Hey,
Right.
online.
Sandra, do you have a suggestion for relatively inexpensive but good quality microscopes if
I
people
have
are
to,
interested?
I think honestly, you can just go to Aussie Microscopes or whatever it's called, and the first thing that comes up, and it will just say, this is good for soil biology,
Right.
they range anywhere from, like, I think maybe 500 up. Probably 700 is like a, minimum you want to pay for them. Sometimes you can get secondhand ones, as long as they've got, it will tell you on that website, or any, like, if you just type even soil microscope, soil analysis or something, these days, like, companies sell them. So like in Australia and the US is prolific with, you can just
See,
get amazing
that's the
stuff for
thing.
cheap.
In my old life,
We're still a bit behind, but
I was using a lot of electron microscopes, and I
wow,
had access
electron,
to
love it.
crazy equipment.
Oh,
But here, of
jealous.
course, if you start over, you've got to go out and be a layman buying it
Yeah.
at retail.
That's right. And like, so my idea is that what I would love to do is run courses on this. So all of these aspects we touched upon, that's a lecture in itself, like all on the nutrition part, every organism and what it does and what do you look for. Like, there's so much to learn. So I'm going to be running small and longer courses on this. So if you want to sign up, or just email me at love our soils. I've added into the chat, loveoursoils@gmail.com. And I'll jump on my mailing list, and I'm going to do like educational emails just about my own experiences, and maybe like other people's experiences, all these things we've talked about, to put it onto somewhere, put it on the website, and then run courses from it. Because I think if we have like a resilient community of people, like if I just know it, what's the point? Do you know what I mean? Like, I can get excited and talk about it till the cows come home, but I think if people are really interested, they can literally just reach out, and this information's available, so
Right. And because we've been talking about doing what grows in my subpod. So for
I'd
school
love to
to
do that.
have like a
Yes.
microscope, and then what lives in my subpod, what grows, what's
Yes,
in my subpod. So that level, to take it down to
I think
microscopic as
so.
well, and
I'd love to do
make
that.
up a lesson plan, and let's get it out there in all those schools.
Absolutely.
And yeah, let's work
Yeah,
on that.
yeah,
Let's make that
yeah.
a project.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to, like, when you go to the Giving Soil website, you'll see that there is a component explaining this whole giving of the worm castings to the farmers. So like, it's explained, there's an image for it, and if you love that idea, jump on board. It's at its very grassroots stages. I'm just developing like the worm farming system, and getting people excited about that fungal biomass development. But like, I think anything we do, whether it's subpod, whether it's your flow one, whether it's Giving Soil, worm flow, whatever I call those bins now, because I love them. And it's a recycled thing. So you're taking from landfill, and you're working with the councils where the bins are given, from council. Like, that's how the first workshop went. So we basically took 27 bins that would have been taken into landfill, and now we've made them into these worm farms, like, I'm thinking like, incorporate the community, incorporate the resources that are there that are being thrown out, incorporate all the waste, recycle everything we can, and work as a community in grassroots, small community levels, plant that seed in all communities, you know. And I think that's how it's going to change. As you were saying, Kathryn, it's got to start in cities, you know. It's like, I think cities are also hubs of all of this activity, like community gardens, you know,
Yeah.
schools,
Power to the
teaching
people.
kids,
That's
all of it.
inspiring.
So I hope to be like, you know, marrying all those things through the Giving Soil initiative. That's my plan
Right.
for the future anyway. So
Oh, wonderful.
yeah.
Yay. And now look, we also had Salmia van der Vist. She wanted to hear about the soil fungi and how they're affected by the chop and drop plant systems versus pulling up dead roots. We did that, dead plant roots. We've already kind of
Yes,
covered
we
that.
did.
And then she was also asking about, do certain ground covers inhibit soil fungi? But I suppose, you know,
Yeah, it depends what
it's
fungi, you know, because
depending,
each
yeah.
plant has its own microbiome and it prefers some things. And I think there's definitely all kinds of interactions we're not aware of. And I'm sure there's plants that like just go, no, I'm going to dominate and I'm going to, you know, suppress other plants from, there's all this allopathic thing going on. And I'm sure it does happen. There's, you know, some people say there's like mycorrhizal warfare going on. But I don't look at it that way, because I look at it like we're just studying something in isolation. We're not looking at the entire ecosystem. So we can't really say that this is happening because we don't know all the other interactions. I think science tends to go into this like,
breaks it down micro.
like this is now bad because we've studied this little bit. It's like, we don't get it. Like, you know, we don't, because you can't study things in isolations and make truthful extrapolations. There's certain things we can do, but I think like, you know, bottling nature, putting things into a lab, all of that. Yes, we've done it and it's great because it increases our knowledge, but there's so many other players and so many other interactions and communication networks happening that we don't understand. And we're never asking, why is that happening? Like there's a reason, for example, that weed grows. We know that, right? Because the succession has been pulled back. There's no fungi, a weed will have to grow because there's nothing else to fix that soil. And that's the plant that's going to do the job. So I think it's the same sort of just understanding that biodiversity is the answer to everything. We probably will ask different questions. We'll be asking like, how can I make it more biodiverse? You know, why won't this grow? What's happening in my soil? Can my worm castings fix that? So I think really thinking more symbiotically with everything and putting ourselves in the custodianship role. I don't even know what you can call it, like someone that guides it rather than someone that thinks that, you know, we know better, because we don't. We're just experimenters and we're just here to, I suppose, I think really the purpose is just to wonder at how wonderful and marvelous it all is, and that how can we be a part, like we're a part of this. This is like, you know, I love like that just childlike sort of attitude to nature. I think if we can have that back in all of us, remove all the things we've learned as adults, like weeds are bad, blah, blah, blah. As a kid, you don't think that way. You just wonder at the beautiful flower and the butterfly that just flew by, you know. Yes, we have to manage because we've screwed up. I'm not saying we should just let it all go. No, but we can work with it rather than against it. And I think that's the bottom line, you know.
Understand our role as working with it rather than against it.
Yeah, no plant is ever bad. It was never just created to be noxious or terrible. There's a purpose for it. It all has its purpose. It just sometimes we see it as, unfortunately, you know, something that's annoying to us. And the only reason why it's annoying is because we've been taught a specific way to think about it or to believe of it, and it's not necessarily true. So we need to be very much more all-encompassing and, I don't know, just like a kid, but why, mummy? But why?
Right.
You know, and
All
often you'll
right.
get those
Well,
answers come to you.
my tummy's really rumbling
Oh,
now.
yes,
How
yes.
did you have anything you needed to?
No, I think we've covered a lot of ground. I think people are
You
probably
have.
pretty full at this point, but if other questions occur, then they could always put in the
Right.
comment section and we could get back to them about them.
Yeah, great. I'm going to put all of your contact details into the event that we just had. So if anybody's looking for it, go into the past events on Grow Hub, and there'll be Sandra's. Oh, we've got someone just joining us. Oh, hi Pam. We're just winding up. It's we've been in here for nearly an hour and 40 minutes now. But I was just saying we're gonna post the recording. We're gonna post Sandra's link to her website and all of her information, and as well as her email account. And of course, she's a member of Grow Hub, so you can always message her directly through Grow Hub if you've got any questions, or pop them into the event, and Peter and Sandra will be able to answer them. Just Pam, while you're here, if you had any specific question that you had burning, you can unmute yourself, and we can ask Sandra. But I'm hungry. I'm done.
Toilet break.
All right, looks like Pam's just listening. So thank you, Pam, for joining, and thanks, Morel, too. I'm glad you enjoyed the session, and yeah, thinking
Aw.
differently about weeds. Me too.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yay.
guys, we look forward to hearing more. And Sandra, stay tuned and
Yep.
close to
Yep.
Subpod,
Thanks,
because we love what you
guys.
do.
Thank
Thank you
you,
so much.
Sandra.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much, guys, for
Kathryn.
having me, and for all the people that could join us. And thanks, Peter, for your knowledge, and Kathryn for your beautiful heart to like just open this space up for us and have
Always.
some excellent questions.
Thanks,
Yeah, great.
everyone.
Yeah, and
Bye-bye.
see you
See
for
ya.
Dr. Compost next Thursday, everyone. If you can join in, Peter will
Mhm.
be there to answer some questions. So yeah, join us
Okay.
anytime, Sandra.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.